afternoon, everyone. Let me see. Let me get this coordinated. Oh, I might still need you. Nope, I'm good. Thanks. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you, Joe, very much for the invitation and also for organizing this. You are truly a friend to Canadian history, and this is a terrific manifestation of that. Also, I have to tell you, I'm a little intimidated right now because Mr. Jackman is here, Hal Jackman, who I guess I can reveal at this point was a source for the book, given that it's more than 30 years ago. You bought the book, even more important. And I was looking up here how many times you're in the index, because that's what everybody does when they're in a book. And it's too many for me to tell you, substantial. But what I can remember vividly was your independent take on everything and your reluctance to buy the received wisdom of the time. And that was critical, as I think you'll see in this narrative I have. So journalism versus academe, I do actually feel that journalists contribute to Canadian history, business history in particular, which may be why we got the invitation. And that certainly in the 1980s when this book came out, I think it was 86, it was a heyday of business book journalism, and a lot of fabulous tales were told that probably today wouldn't be told. They just wouldn't make the cut unless it was a vanity book. And I'm biased, obviously, but I do think the Trust Company saga is an important one in Canadian history, partly because the stories were so crazy, and secondly, because it really was at the change point in Canadian business life between the old and the new. I'll get to that in a second. And then finally, because the regulators who did not distinguish themselves well during this period came to understand, finally, too late for some companies, that the business had changed irrevocably, and that the way they had done things, which really was based on trust, audits might not get turned in, no big deal, didn't have enough regulators, that was okay, believe the words of people running the companies, which sometimes could be believed and sometimes could not. Clearly, in the Trust Company saga, the failure of regulators, and there was a huge failure, but also the essential limitations of regulation when it comes to regulating crooks, is at the heart of that story, and I think still is at the heart of the story. Regulation, and we have like onerous amounts of it now in the financial business, especially for small firms. Mine, I have a front row seat to regulation in small financial firms, is absolutely unbelievable. To people outside wouldn't believe how much time is spent just on satisfying regulators. And that's all good because it's all to protect the public and the client. However, the fact remains that you can't regulate against crooks. They find a way around, and we continue to see that, whether it's big systemic crooks like the financial collapse in the U.S. or in the subprime, or it's small-time crooks like Lenny Rosenberg, who was the owner of one of the trust companies that I'm going to talk about. The Trust Company saga was also a wonderful meeting point for another theme in Canadian business that has been for decades, and in fact not just business, the Canadian society, and that is the conflict between outsiders and insiders, between the custodians and the entrepreneurs, the people who should have it and the people who want it. And when I should, I put that in quotes. And this continues to be a theme. So, matter of trust, greed, government, and Canada's $60 billion trust industry, so $60 billion. I was going to look up what that represents in bank earnings, probably 10 minutes or something, I don't know. It's not a big number now, but back then it was a significant part of the financial industry, and also trust companies were one of the 4 pillars. You may not have even heard of that. 4 pillars: banks, insurance companies, investment dealers, and trust companies. Those were the 4 pillars, and they were supposed to be separate and do separate things. Trust companies still exist. You're probably not aware of them. There aren't any storefronts, but even old names like Royal Trust, Canada Trust, National Trust exist, but they are incorporated into larger financial institutions. For example, Canada Trust and TD Bank. They're regulated by OSFI, Office of the Superintendent for Financial Institutions, now, which is a much more comprehensive and tougher place than the former kind of hodgepodge of regulators in the 1980s and earlier. So there are now 44 trust companies. When I looked that up, I couldn't believe it. And so they exist, but in a very small way, and they're just not anywhere. They're not able to be vehicles the way they were during the 1980s. So what is a trust company? It's a financial institution that operates under either provincial or federal legislation and conducts activities similar to a business, but it has a fiduciary role and can administer trusts, estates, pension plans, agency contracts, and banks are not allowed to do that. So that's why banks own trust companies now. When I started, you mentioned the McLeans, but I actually started at the Financial Post, and I was working there as a reporter covering financial institutions, and started to cover these stories, these odd stories about these odd people taking these trust companies over. And in the 1980s, as documented here, there were a number of takeovers, mergers, a number of unknown people who came into the business and took over trust companies from the establishment, and started to really focus on not the state and trust side, which is what the kind of old Canadian financial establishment had been doing with their trust companies, and focused on mortgage lending, which, as we know, is a reliable source of financial failure and fraud throughout history. And so from 1983 to 1986, it says here 6 trust companies failed. It could be a little more than that, actually. And in all cases, either insufficient regulation, bad lending practices, and actual criminal acts. Most of it was poor management and really playing the rules as hard as you could. The key to these old trust companies was that they could be wholly owned. So unlike banks, which had limits on how much of a bank you could own, these could be wholly owned, and that's a prerequisite for non-arm's length dealings. And so that's why they were so attractive. So I'm trying not to do too much here, but I wanted to, some of this is, So before 1980, for decades, trust companies were the height, they were the epitome of the way things were done, the family compact style, the Anglo-Canadian club that ran financial institutions. And inherent in it, but they saw it as benevolent, were conflicts of interest. They had these conflicts of interest just the way the new guys had, but they were seen as for higher purpose amongst themselves. And I'll explain that in a second. So trust, the word trust is an Old Norse word, and it's the same word as fiduciary. And in British common law, trust is a confidence reposed in an objective but benevolent individual who has a duty to act with fidelity and diligence for the client. And the way regulators approached trust companies and banks was with that in mind, that good people owned and ran these things, and we could trust them to do the right thing. How they did it, though, nowadays wouldn't pass muster. That could be well true, and outright criminality was really not a part of it. But clubbiness and one friend helping another definitely was part of the old system. I'm going to give you an example in a minute, but I just want to make the point that this trust, this notion of trust and the definition of it, I feel is a primary source of the tension that lies in financial regulation. So, and we now see it, the same thing in the attempt to regulate big banks, broker-dealers, financial advisors. For example, financial advisors are supposed to be acting in your best interest. Overwhelmingly, most of them do. Absolutely. Some don't. Inevitably, the really egregious examples had no intention of behaving that way, and like the characters in this book and in the trust company saga, they do it till they get caught. They aren't playing by the rules. So that continues to be a challenge for regulators, which I don't believe they'll ever solve. And I don't think more heavier, intrusive regulation will stop this. All it will do is make compliance so impossible for small players that only the big players, like the big banks, will be able to afford it and survive. I should mention also Anne Shortell was a co-author of this. She was my colleague at the Post at the time. So we're covering these stories. We came to understand that the people involved in this seminal moment in kind of financial industry history in Canada had a cast of characters that Hollywood would envy. A really vivid couple were Leonard Rosenberg and Billy Player, who were sketchy guys in Ontario who took over Crown Trust and proceeded to flip 26 major apartment buildings they bought from Cadillac Fairview. These were, at the time, big properties and worth a lot of money. They used their own mortgage money in the company to fuel it all, and went on a kind of a binge, a wild chase for 3 months until the regulators finally clued in. On the other side, just to give you a flavor of this trust business, was a wonderful character. Maybe you knew him. Conrad Featherston Harrington. Do you remember that? Yeah. So actually a lovely man who cooperated on this book, who was a director of Royal Trust and may have been a senior officer at one point. He epitomized the old Canadian way, extremely gracious person. And he and Royal Trust President Ken White became embroiled in a takeover battle over Royal Trust around this time in the early 80s that involved a man called Robert Campeau. And Robert Campeau was a real estate guy. He had made a fortune leasing office space to the federal government somehow. He liked gold faucets in his bathrooms. He had a suite at the Harbour Castle Hotel, which at that time was a pretty swish place right on the waterfront. Really nouveau, as the Featherston Harringtons would see it. And they couldn't believe the audacity of Mr. Campeau making a bid for this company. And they felt it completely inappropriate that someone like him would own a corporate jewel, a real corporate. The Royal Trust was a corporate jewel of Canada. It had been around since the 1800s. It was solidly at the pinnacle of the financial business, 78. So when Mr. Campeau made his bid, the Royal Trust people, the head of Royal Trust, could not believe. They just truly could not believe it. And this really is why I say it was kind of a seminal moment in Canadian business history, because the old ways and the assumptions were just crashing at this point. So Campeau told us, he said that, who was the president, White began to rave. According to Campo, he declared it would certainly affect his role at Royal Trust. He would quit. And I really don't like you, Campo, and I don't like Paul Demery, and I don't like Conrad Black, and I don't like Edgar Bronfman. He called him Bronfman. I don't like all these guys making bids for public corporations, and I wish to hell you would stay where you are and don't bother us. This is really going to complicate the Bank Act, and it's really not helping the French-Canadian and English-Canadian situation.
Hear, hear.
So, I mean, you could make a movie about this. So after exhaustive efforts to repel Mr. Campo, and history would show, although it sounds pretty closed club, they weren't entirely wrong about thinking Robert Campo wasn't a good proprietor of Royal Trust or any trust company. They ended up, through a series of machinations and by rallying their fellows in the Anglo-Canadian business community, ended up selling Royal Trust to the Reichman family. And it was a bewildering solution to this problem when they didn't want outsiders in. And they struck a deal where the shareholders' rights were not considered at all. There was absolutely no effort to maximize shareholder value or get the best price at all. It was strictly about repelling Campo. Later, through another series of machinations, the Reichmans sold to the Edper Bronfmans, which is Edward and Peter Bronfman, who went on to build Brascan, as people knew it, and is now really the big infrastructure company, what's it called? Brookfield, thank you. So try as they might to stop the ocean from coming through the dike, they weren't able to, and some of their solutions were bewildering. As I said, the story of the trust companies in the 80s was definitely about custodians versus entrepreneurs, about Anglo-Canada versus others, including trying to keep out Jewish businessmen for sure, deal makers, which was a pejorative term, and anyone of modest means, because they weren't appropriate. And they did make the argument that they were unfit and possibly crooks. And unfortunately, some of them were crooks. So it wasn't a pure play at all. So people like Leonard Rosenberg and Bill Blair, and another man you probably heard of, Peter Pocklington, who ended up having to hawk his contract with Wayne Gretzky to pay all his debts. He took a run at Fidelity Trust. He got into trouble for the same reasons they all did, which is trying to leverage real estate through the lending ability of the trust company, taking on too much. And in Alberta, they were going through what they're going through now, and house prices were falling, and real estate was worthless. And thus, he went into debt, and I believe now lives in L.A. and chooses not to come back to Canada in case something happens. So I think of the many, many stories in here, and so many trust companies that had the same narrative of leveraging the lending abilities. How they used to do it, of course, was that they would take deposits and then lend out. The estate and trust business was not even paid attention to. But the best one was Crown Trust. So Crown Trust, blue blood institution, if ever there was one. Two Moncton businessmen named Leonard Ellen and Reuben Cohen. So these two guys, they were like bootstraps guys on the East Coast, worked hard, good businessmen. They had set their hearts on owning a national trust company from Moncton. And they decided Crown Trust was the right vehicle. So they began, this would never happen now, they began courting the powers that be at Crown Trust, which were all of the usual players and all of their friends who were at the banks. Keep in mind, trust companies at that point, and for decades before, since they started, would have interlocking directorships with banks and would literally send business to each other. They weren't competing in a way. They also had, now they talked about the self-dealing of these nouveau people, but they themselves would have family members on the board and as officers. But that was because they were being benevolent, fiduciary-minded people. I'm being sarcastic there. So Cohen and Ellen go about it, using their contacts, approaching people a little bit cap in hand. They figured, don't upset the apple cart, we can do this. Bud MacDougall, and I hope people know who he is because there's too much to explain about him, one of Canada's famous business figures, was at the center of Crown Trust. He had a nephew running it, and his alliance with Conrad Black subsequently. So Bud MacDougall got wind of this, and behind the scenes freaked out, to use a modern word, and he suspected they were flippers, they were up to no good, and he started calling all his establishment friends to stop this bid. But what they did out in front was just stall Cohen and Ellen, and they ended up stalling them for 12 years. So they would say, oh, we might make a deal soon, or oh, come back next year. And these poor guys, and they weren't, they wanted the trust company for a reason, too. They saw the affinity with real estate. They would do that. They would wait. So 12 long years this went on. It would never happen today. And meanwhile, Conrad Black enters the picture as an ally of MacDougall. He wants Crown Trust because Crown Trust owns shares in a company he wants. So he's only interested in getting Crown to get the shares. He doesn't care about the actual trust company. He gets it because, of course, he's one of them. And he ends up selling it to Canwest, the Canwest Capital, which was owned at the time by Izzy Asper and Jerry Schwartz of Onyx fame. So they were deemed to be appropriate. Cohen and Ellen weren't. And the deal Black struck was that Schwartz and Asper would give him, and by then Cohen and Ellen had a portion, like I think 30% of the company, give him one share price, and Cohen and Ellen a drastically reduced share price. This was all okay with everybody. So Cohen and Ellen were outraged. They couldn't believe it. Regulators did nothing. Deal went ahead. And they were outraged. So they sold their shares to a Toronto businessman called Joe Burnett. Joe Burnett. So Joe Burnett was a real estate guy, and I'm trying to find him here because I can't really describe him appropriately without reading it. Joe Burnett. The OSC had launched an unusual hearing about Burnett's suitability for a trust license based on an outstanding criminal income tax charge, and really fueled by stories that had trailed Burnett for years, including loan sharking, squeezing out small contractors in shopping center developments, not being overly careful about who he lent money to or acting for in a legal matter, including a friendship with John Pullman, who was a friend of former U.S. mafia king Meyer Lansky. So the regulators figured he was not a good idea. So they insisted that this deal be unwound, but not really unwound, that they find another buyer. Burnett find another buyer, which he did. And he found Leonard Rosenberg. He owned these shares in Crown Trust for 3 weeks, I think. 6 weeks, and made a $6.5 million profit on the shares. So he didn't do too badly. And he sold to Lenny Rosenberg, who was a small-time business guy and real estate guy, who then, as I told you earlier, flipped these giant apartment buildings, lent to himself, brought in this guy, Billy Player from Elmvale, did side deals, did deals behind, sold to part of it to an Arab businessman, which at that time wasn't being done here. Lots of non-arm's length deals and really bad lending. So the regulators finally figured it out and put a stop to it. But the regulators were in disbelief, like pretty well everyone was. But the regulators could not keep up with the scope and the size of change in the industry, and they had no clue what to do. They kept thinking they did. They kept promising things. They literally would make announcements that everything was under control while the next scandal was brewing, and there would be another trust company scandal. There were way few regulators. Wasn't a priority. The reason anyone should care is many people lost money. So depositors were protected up to $60,000. But a lot of these companies had preferred shareholders. And preferred shareholders were not protected. And by and large, they were elderly people. They liked the income. So they lost absolutely everything. Pocklington wiped them out. The Cormies in Principal Trust in Edmonton wiped them out. Many examples of this. I did a radio show publicizing the book in Vancouver, and people would call crying about having lost all their money. It was absolutely horrible. So although it's amusing to see the kind of Wild West antics, there was a real price to be paid for the really inferior regulation of this business at that time. So I'll wind up by just saying that I think that the regulators learned something. Certainly everything got cleaned up, new enforcement bodies, new rules. Everyone learned a lesson. And, with all of these disasters, I think what you see is reaction on the other side so that you get more onerous regulation, illogical enforcement, and I think a continuing theme that the establishment financial institutions not only can weather this increase in scrutiny better, but some of the practices often don't get the scrutiny they might because we have the too big to fail problem here. I guess I'll conclude by saying that having done this book and met some of these characters, that if crooks have a will, then they will find a way. Thank you.